And then for 3.5 years, he was a traveling preacher and teacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had his own family or owned his own house. He didn't go to college. He never visited a big city. In fact, he never traveled more than 200 miles from the place where he was born. He did none of the things which one usually associates with greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. He was turned over to his enemies, and then he went through a mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a stake between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his clothing, the only property that he owned on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 20 centuries have come and gone, and today he is the central figure of the human race. So goes the anonymous commentary of the life of Jesus Christ. This same writer who wrote this poem here ended by saying, all the armies that have ever marched, all the navies that have ever sailed, all the parliament that have ever sat, all the kings that have ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of man on earth as Jesus Christ. Isn't it true that Jesus is the greatest man who ever lived? In fact, no one in history has ever affected human life or the human story like Jesus Christ. But I want you to think for a moment about in today's society. Think about people in the world today, or even back in history, who people think that are important or that are great. Usually, people that are held at this pedestal, to remember them or to memorialize them, they may create images or erect buildings or statues of them. For example, think about ancient Egypt. They viewed their pharaohs as gods, right? And so, to remember such ones, they would erect these big old pyramids. Now, the one that's the largest in Egypt stood over 500 feet tall. And it took 100,000 men almost 20 years to complete. Now, that's quite a feat for just one king. Now, let's take a more recent example. The first president of the United States, George Washington. As a tribute to him, they raised a monument that stands over 500 feet tall, and it stands in the city that bears his name. There's a highway named after him. There are lakes named after him. There are mountains named after him. There are schools named after Washington. If you reach in your pocket, you pull out, there's $1 with his face on it. You pull out a quarter, his face is on it. His face is even carved on a side of a mountain in the Dakotas. Now, all of that to remember a man who some view as great. But think about the greatest man who ever lived, Jesus Christ. He never asked for a statue. He never asked for a pyramid. He never asked for a monument. But did you know that Jesus gave his disciples instructions on how he wanted to be remembered? I invite you to open your Bibles to the book of Luke. Let's turn to Luke chapter 22, and let's read together verse 19 and 20. That's Luke 22, verse 19 and 20. And again, what we're looking for is, did Jesus give his disciples instructions on how he wanted to be remembered? Notice what he said. Also, he took a loaf, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This means my body, which is to be given in your behalf." And notice this, "Keep doing this in remembrance of me." Also, he did the same with the cup after they had the evening meal, saying, "This cup means the new covenant by virtue of my blood, which is to be poured out in your behalf. Did you notice how Jesus requested for his disciples to remember him in the Bible? Well, Jesus commanded his disciples to remember him by a simple ceremony, one that's to be held annually. Now, compared to pyramids and statues, you may think, wow, this doesn't seem very grand. But did you know that in the Bible, this event is the only special occasion that the Bible commands Christians that we should follow and observe? So this is a very important occasion, and for Jehovah's Witnesses, it's the most important day of the year. This can be seen, for example, last year, nearly 20 million people around the world in over 240 countries came together to observe the Lord's evening meal. In this year, people will meet in kingdom halls, assembly halls, rented facilities like this one right here. People will meet in fields, in prisons. And did you know that people would even risk their lives and risk their freedom to observe this memorial in countries where our work is banned? Now, of course, in this country, we have freedom of religion. But maybe some of you had to make some adjustments in your schedule to join us. Did you have to take off some time from work? Did you drive a number of miles to join us? If you have, we thank you, and we are glad that you are here with us. And as I look out to the audience today, I see a lot of people. Maybe you're here for the first time. Did one of Jehovah's Witnesses give you an invitation? Are they your neighbor, your workmate, an acquaintance? Maybe it's your family member. However you receive that invitation, we welcome you and we are glad you are here with us. On this date, almost 2,000 years ago, Jesus gave his life in order to rescue us from sin and death. So, in obedience to that command, we will observe the Lord's evening meal tonight. And most importantly, let's show our appreciation for what Christ did for us. Now, to help us understand this memorial, we're going to briefly answer 4 questions. The first, why do humans, and by extension, you and I, need to be rescued from sin and death? 2, who benefit from Jesus' sacrifice? 3, who partake of the bread and the wine that we have here, our emblems? And then 4, besides this meeting, this special occasion, are there other things that you and I can do to show our appreciation for what Jesus has done for us? Let's take our first question. Why do humans, or you and I, need to be rescued from sin and death? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back to the beginning of time. In fact, in the first 3 chapters of the Bible book of Genesis, it tells us a story about our first parents, Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve initially, they had everything. Perfect life, perfect health. They were to live forever, and they lived in a paradise. But to enjoy that, God put a commandment on them. Contingent on to keep that, they had to be obedient, right? So Jehovah gave them one divine law. There was a particular tree in the garden that belonged to Jehovah, so they were not to partake of it. And as their creator, doesn't Jehovah have the right to stipulate or to give restrictions on the people he created? Well, we know how the story goes. Adam and Eve broke God's law, and as a result, they personally lost the prospect of everlasting life. And so they became sinners, and they eventually died. But here's the question. Did Adam's decision affect more people than just himself? Are we affected by what he did? I invite you to go to your Bibles to the book of Romans chapter 5, and we'll find the answer to that. Again, did Adam's actions have far-reaching consequences? The book of Romans chapter 5, verse 12. It says, that is why, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin. And so death spread to all men because they had all sinned. Let's talk about this scripture for a moment. Did you notice it said through one man? In the Bible, we know that man to be Adam. Yes, because Adam sinned, death and sin spread to all of us. You see, it's like we inherited a terrible disease from our first father. What was that disease? It's sin. And because we sin, we are now subject to old age, sickness, and eventually death. And so now we can see that because of what Adam did, we're in this terrible, sad situation. So could we ever be rescued? Well, the answer found in the Bible is loving, yet just, but elegantly simple. You see, God made arrangements to redeem mankind by means of a ransom. Why? Why did Jehovah do that? Well, none of us could ever pay the ransom. Why not? Well, all of us are imperfect. You see, the ransom had to be paid with another perfect human life. That's why in the Bible, it's called a corresponding ransom. So Jesus' life had the same value of what Adam lost. And so what did Jehovah do? Well, he transferred the life of Jesus from heaven to earth. And so Jesus was born as a perfect human, free from sin. Now, here's our next question. How could one man be the ransom for all humans? It's a good question, right? Now, we learn that by one man, all of us lost perfection, right? One man caused us all to be sinners. So the question begs, could another man remove death for all? Could one man make everything right? Let's go back to the 5th chapter of Romans. We'll answer that question. Romans chapter 5, this time verse 19. It says, "For just as through this disobedience of the one man," speaking of Adam, "many were made sinners," that's you and I. "And so also through the obedience of the one person," speaking of Jesus, "many will be made righteous." So you see, through the obedience of one man, many will be made righteous. Yes, because of Jesus' actions, we have a chance to soon live without sin and death. Now, how is this possible? Well, when Jesus lived, he never sinned. And so his life was a perfect ransom. His perfect life could then be used to remove the curse of sin and death. And again, as a result, you and I can now have a righteous standing before God and have the prospect of living forever. In a sense, Jesus took Adam's place as our father. That's why in the Bible it calls Jesus the last Adam. The first Adam sent all of us, you and I, on a path of destruction. The last Adam, who is Jesus, he provided deliverance by his obedience and gave his life in our behalf. So did Jesus have to die? Well, it certainly wasn't for any sins on his part. The Bible said he was without sin. So Jesus took our place, suffering death so that we could live forever. Notice how this is highlighted in the book of Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2, let's read together verse 9. And notice how Jesus took our place. The book of Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9. "But we do see Jesus, who was made a little lower than angels, now crowned with glory and honor for having suffered death." Why? "So that by God's undeserved kindness, he might taste death for everyone." You see, so Jesus tasted death for you and I. He died for us. So we're amazed and so thankful for what Jesus did for us. He died so that we could live. But live where? It's a good question. In heaven or on earth? Now, many religions today teach that all good people go to heaven when they die. But the Bible teaches that God's original purpose for Adam, and by extension all of us, was to live right here on earth in paradise. That was God's original purpose. So which is it? Well, the reality is that the Bible does speak of two different hopes or destinies.